The late afternoon sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a golden hue across the quiet apartment. Everything in the room remained untouched. The piano, the half-finished cup of tea, the chair where I used to sit and watch the city drift by. He thought I didn't know. Thought I was too loving to suspect, too gentle to resist. But my silence wasn't ignorance, it was patience. I was waiting for the right moment to let go and let them burn in the fire they lit themselves. I heard every laugh behind closed doors, saw every glance they thought was hidden. And I realized love, when dismissed, doesn't dissolve, it turns to glass. And one day, they would have to look into it and watch themselves burn. Welcome to this story. That morning, the sunlight slipped quietly through the burgundy velvet drapes slanting across the marble floors, as if too polite to enter directly into a space that had grown used to silence. It painted long golden streaks along the columns in the great room, columns that looked in the morning stillness like bones wrapped in satin. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, the cold of the stone biting gently into my skin, a sensation that reminded me almost tenderly that I was still alive. Both hands cradled the Staffordshire teapot, a wedding gift from someone whose name I no longer remembered. The water had just reached a soft boil. I poured slowly, but my hand betrayed me. The stream of tea missed the cup's edge, spilling amber over the saucer, down the porcelain, and onto the counter. One drop landed on my wrist. I didn't flinch. I just watched it spread like a secret no one bothered to contain anymore. In this 3-story mansion with 14 rooms and 22 windows, I once believed I was the happiest woman in the world. That was before this morning. Before I opened the guest room drawer, a drawer Charles never used, and found a pair of earrings that weren't mine. They were small, simple, white pearls rimmed with imitation diamonds. Tasteful, forgettable. The kind of earrings a young girl might wear to a dinner date, hoping to look more expensive than she felt. I held them in my palm and stared as though they might shift themselves into something more innocent. But they didn't. They just lay there, cheap, soft, and entirely wrong. I don't wear fakes, not out of vanity, but because when you're born into wealth, you're taught to recognize the real from the imitation, not just in jewelry, but in people, in promises, in love. I remember laughing once, years ago, when Charles told a room full of donors I had a gift for quiet elegance. Oh, I smiled like a good wife does, nodded graciously, and took a sip of champagne. I was already pregnant with his career. I just didn't know it yet. Charles Whitmore, rising political star charm in tailored suits and handshake smiles. To the world he was brilliant, composed, devoted. To me he was curated, carefully edited, like a museum exhibit that never changed no matter how long you stood in front of it. And I was the girl who once turned down a Vogue cover because it conflicted with a quarterly board meeting. I was the woman who has quietly stepped back as a housewife to take care of my husband, not because she wanted to, but because the man she loved asked her to help build something bigger. Together. And I believed him. God help me, I believed him. However, he didn't know that I was still the chairman, the highest shareholder of the company, and still the daughter of a hidden billionaire. So here I am, Eleanor Whitmore, 37 years old, still beautiful in that practiced Southern way, peach-touch skin, polished mahogany hair. Wife of a man admired by voters. Mistress of a house filled with light silence. And a guest room drawer with earrings that didn't belong to me. People like to think betrayal arrives loudly, lipstick on collars, strange perfume, angry voices down hallways. But betrayal is quiet. It comes during tea. It whispers through curtains. It leaves fingerprints on things you thought were only yours. And sometimes It looks like two little pearls resting in velvet, beside a heart already cracking quietly where no one can see. I was once Eleanor Beaumont. Yes, that name still appears in a few yellowing financial magazines. They used to call me the Queen of East Coast Real Estate before I turned 30. I never chased that title, nor did I deny it. I simply worked. I signed contracts in boardrooms colder than morgues. I resurrected dead neighborhoods with glass towers and green courtyards, reviving them like phoenixes in silk gowns. I was no stranger to the sound of gavels on polished wood, of champagne corks popping after a deal closed, or of sleepless nights over blueprints that smelled of ink and new ambition. I remember the day Charles walked into my life, charming, articulate, with eyes that didn't fear a successful woman, but saw in her opportunity. He didn't fall in love with me, like a man falls for a woman. He selected me the way a man selects land flat, vast, and full of potential. When he said he was running for office, I gave everything up in a single evening. Not because he forced me, but because he said it with that honeyed tone men use when they want something without ever asking, "You'll be the wife of a senator." And I smiled like I'd just been offered a crown. I hung a sign on my life that read, "Temporarily closed," and I locked the door behind it with my own hands. They say Southern women are born to be wives. They know how to steep tea just right, how to tilt their chin during handshakes, how to smile just enough at parties where they're expected to be luminous, but never too bright. I did all of that. At every spring cocktail event, I stood beside the fireplace in ivory silk gowns, smiling like a porcelain bust. I listened to other wives whisper about each other, about Botox, about affairs, about who wasn't invited. I didn't speak much. I held my martini like a stage prop, never drinking, only something to keep my hands from trembling. Charles came home late often, especially after private meetings. Sometimes his collar would carry the faintest trace of blush, not mine, and a perfume I would never wear, cheap, sharp, and too sweet. I thought of asking more than once. But then I remembered we weren't married like ordinary people. We were a couple on a magazine cover, beautiful, correct, unbroken. Cracks had to stay behind doors, or better beneath the rug. In the living room stood a grand Steinway piano, a wedding gift from my father, who is a self-made rich billionaire that my husband didn't know. He once told me no one touches that unless they truly love music. Charles didn't play. I did 8 years of lessons. But I hadn't touched the keys in so long the ivory had yellowed slightly. And every time I passed it, I felt as though I was the one being forgotten. Sometimes I would sit on the bench not to play, but to listen to the silence. The kind of silence that weighs more than sorrow. A silence so thick it muffled even my own breathing. I remember an early autumn night standing on the upstairs balcony, watching Charles pace the backyard, whispering into his phone in the dark. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, a habit of his when he lied. When he came inside, I was seated in the living room, a book open but unread in my lap. He leaned down, kissed my forehead, and that scent returned sweet, cloying foreign. I used to dream that one day he would confess, that he'd look at me and say, "I've betrayed you, Eleanor, and I'm sorry." A small part of me, the part that still believed in love, waited for that. But the years taught me something else. Men like Charles don't apologize. They simply deny until no one's left to listen. Once I asked, "Are you happy?" He looked at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. Then he smiled, that polite, polished politician smile, and said, "We're living a wonderful life, aren't we?" Oh, I saw it clearly, but it wasn't my life. It was paper thin. A facade held up by headlines, money, and retouched photos. And I was the actress who had long forgotten her lines. So I learned silence. I survived by smiling. I turned down the volume of the piano in my chest until no one could hear it, not even me. But the piano had stayed. It never left. And I know someday I will touch the keys again, and this time I won't play someone else's song. It will be mine, and it will be true. Recall the earrings. I left them neatly wrapped in a silk scarf, tucked away in a drawer beneath old notebooks. Not because I wanted to keep them, but because I needed a place to imprison clarity. From the moment I saw them, I knew this wasn't about if he cheated. It was about how stupid he thought I was. The man I once called my husband, Charles, probably never truly understood me. He mistook gentleness for weakness, silence for submission. But I was born in a world where silence is sharp, where power comes from watching without blinking. I knew how to wait, and I knew how to see. After the earrings, everything became stark. I didn't need to dig. I didn't need to hire anyone. The evidence revealed itself as if it wanted to be caught. In his car, I found a long honey blonde hair stuck in the passenger seat belt. I don't dye my hair. No one else should have been there, at least not according to Charles. On his desk, a dinner receipt for two at a restaurant I'd never been to. The date matched the night he claimed to be in Colombia for a late meeting. At the bottom of the receipt, Clarice V. I recognized the name. His new communications assistant. Young, eager, always standing too close in photographs. I didn't rage, didn't cry. I didn't clench my fists or smash dishes. The only thing I felt was a widening void in my chest, a quiet, aching hollowness. Not heartbreak, reckoning. I started keeping track. A slim leather notebook. I noted the hours he came home late, the shifts in his tone, the new colognes he never wore before. I traced every inconsistency. No accusations, no confrontations. Just quiet, careful documentation. Like a historian recording the slow decay of an empire that once believed itself eternal. Then there was the mirror. I found myself returning to it again and again. Morning, night, in between. And each time I saw less of a wife and more of a witness. The woman who once believed in us had been replaced by someone still beautiful, but sharper, sadder, and done pretending. One evening, Charles told me, "You don't have to come to Saturday's gala. You've been tired lately." I smiled, soft, controlled. "You're right. I am tired. But not from needing rest. I'm tired of seeing too clearly." He hesitated, then gave his politician smile, the kind that answers nothing and reveals even less. That night I unlocked the safe and pulled out every document still bearing my name. Properties, shares, trusts, all still under my quiet control. My private lawyer, whom Charles never knew about, remained on retainer. I wasn't preparing for divorce, not yet. Some implosions need to happen publicly. I started clearing shelves, not because I was leaving, but because I was ready. Later that night, I sat at the grand piano. I didn't play. I just touched the keys, cold and familiar, a part of myself I'd buried long ago. I let a recording play instead, a sonata I once performed when I was 28. The notes filled the house, not mournful, not proud, just honest. In the reflection of the glass, I saw myself, thinner, straighter. Strange even to me, love when scorned doesn't disappear. It becomes a mirror. And one day they'll have to stand in front of it and see themselves burn. The days that followed moved as if someone had pressed a slow motion button on my life. Every gesture, every glance, every word carried a weight that wasn't there before. I no longer lived in the mansion as a wife. I lived as a spectator, like the whole house had become a theater, and I was the sole audience member, silently watching it all unfold. I saw how Charles grew restless when Clarice didn't text back. How he secretly checked his phone during dinner, something he used to scold others for. I heard the car door shut at 2 a.m., the water running in the bathroom after his late returns, and smelled the unfamiliar soap clinging to the towels, something I'd never bought nor would. I let those things pass through me like a wordless piece of music. No reaction, no judgment, just proof. Note by note, a composition of endings that had already been written. One afternoon, I saw Clarice in the campaign office hallway. She walked past me, as if I were part of the decor, a decorative wall, elegant but outdated. But I saw how she looked at Charles. Not with hesitation, but with ownership. I didn't feel anger. I felt regret. Regret for having once underestimated myself enough to think that silence could preserve something already rotting. That night, I returned to our room and uncovered our wedding photo hidden behind a curtain of dust. We were both smiling. I wore ivory lace. He wore black tux. But our eyes never touched. I hadn't noticed it before. But now it was obvious. I took the photo out of the frame and replaced it with a blank page. On it, I wrote slowly, "You didn't hurt me by betraying me. You hurt me by thinking I wasn't worth the truth. I let them perform for a season. I didn't interrupt the play, didn't deliver a single line. I simply watched quietly from behind the velvet curtain as the two lead actors dazzled themselves with their own farce. But every play needs an ending. And that gala fundraiser, it was the final act, performed under lights too bright to hide anything. The Fairmont Ballroom opened like a grand theater. Crystal chandeliers, French wine, polished handshakes. Charles linked arms with me like we were still the perfect couple. Flashbulbs flickered. I smiled, the curve of my lips soft, but my eyes hollow. I wore a black silk gown, off-shoulder, modest yet striking. But the most deliberate detail was not the dress. It was the earrings I chose to wear. The cheap pearl studs rimmed with fake diamonds, the ones I had found tucked in Clarice's drawer. I didn't wear them for elegance. I wore them for a message meant only for one person in the room. When I stepped into the crowd, Clarice turned, and I saw it. That flicker of panic. Just a breath, a shiver beneath her perfect foundation, but enough. A woman with instincts knows when another woman has seen through the glass. The evening unfolded with classical music and practiced charm. Charles delivered his speech, confident, idealistic pledging, absolute transparency, and family values. I stood nearby, champagne untouched, watching him speak words that had long since lost meaning. Then came my turn, invited on stage as the inspiring wife. I stepped up to the podium lights, warming my face. Charles stood nearby, nodding his eyes full of trust, the trust of a man unaware that the gun has already been loaded. I started gently. I thanked the donors, the campaign team, the community that had believed in Charles and in our marriage. I recounted our early years eating cold pizza in an apartment while dreaming of a better world. Then I shifted. I've come to learn that sometimes the most valuable thing a woman can possess isn't love, it's clarity. And clarity is when you look at someone you love and realize they are no longer that person. The room fell still. Charles gave a tight smile, misreading my words as metaphor. But I continued, slow and sharp. Clarity is finding a pair of earrings under your pillow earrings that don't belong to you. It's recognizing the sighs at night don't come from exhaustion, but from a soul that's tired of pretending. I turned my head slightly, looked straight at Clarice. She froze. Her wine glass trembled. A couple of guests turned to glance her way. No one said a word, but the silence itself was a trial in motion. I ended simply, I don't say this to invite pity. I say it because if you don't speak the truth, it will burn you from the inside out. I stepped down, returned the microphone, and looked Charles in the eyes without anger, without accusation. Just the final gaze of a woman seeing a stranger in the place where her husband used to be. The murmurs swelled behind me. Reporters whispered. A camera shifted angle. Clarice disappeared from the room, not out of fatigue, but because she could no longer stand upright in a room filled with truth. By morning, clips of my speech had flooded the internet. The hashtag Eleanor knows trended across political threads and women's networks. People dug through old photos, Clarice always just a bit too close, too radiant, too present. 3 days later, an anonymous whistleblower exposed questionable expense reports, campaign funds used for internal consulting at luxury hotels. Clarice resigned with a poorly typed statement and no punctuation. And Charles? He held a press conference, live-streamed and brittle. He claimed misunderstandings swore professional boundaries. But when a female journalist raised a photo, Clarice in a silk robe stepping out of a hotel room at 6:12 a.m., his face collapsed. His career didn't burn. It imploded. Donors pulled out. Ethics committees launched investigations. The Charleston City Council canceled his private contracts. Within a week, he had nothing but a dark house full of closed curtains and a wife who had long stopped waiting. Clarice vanished. Rumors placed her somewhere in Oregon, living with her mother offline and invisible. Once she imagined herself a future First Lady. In the end, she didn't even get a goodbye. And me, I gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, signed no streaming rights. I bought a small house by the water in Beaufort. Quiet, modest, free. One soft morning, as the light slipped in like thin linen, I placed the fake earrings on the window ledge, opened the box. The wind caught one. It fell to the garden below, rolled twice, then disappeared beneath the wildflowers. I didn't pick it up. A woman doesn't need to destroy a man with a knife. She only needs the truth and enough silence to let him scream on his own. I left Beaufort on an autumn morning when the mist still clung to the water. I wasn't returning to Charles. I was returning to my name, to the place where I once clicked across marble floors in tiny heels as a little girl, where no one asked me to smile for anyone. The Beaumont estate lies about an hour outside Charleston, tucked behind drooping oaks, its slate roof dark with rain, white walls faded with time. It used to sit silent like a forgotten chapel after my mother's funeral. And yet as I stepped inside now, everything was unchanged, except it no longer felt cold. My father sat at the chess table by the tall window. He didn't look up right away. He simply said softly, "My daughter has finally come home." I said nothing. I sat down across from him on the white side, and I moved the first pawn forward. 3 months later, I formally resumed my position as chairwoman of the Beaumont Group. No press release, no justification. The shareholders greeted me with real handshakes, not too firm, not too flattering, just the kind of greeting you offer someone who's walked through fire and emerged without needing to scream. I restructured the company, removed those who once dismissed my insight when I was Mrs. Whitmore, brought back those who had been loyal and quietly pushed aside for being not photogenic enough. I no longer needed image. I needed truth. I went to work every day in a beige suit, hair tied up, no jewelry. My desk remained uncluttered except for a single photo frame. In it I was 9, sitting on my mother's lap. Behind us, the grand piano I have since returned to the main hall. Each night when I came home, I played a piece. Alone, no audience, no applause. And after all these years, the piano no longer choked. Charles still called, every day at first, then once a week. Eventually, just the occasional text left unanswered. His words never changed. "I'm sorry, we should talk. I made a mistake." But none of them could patch what had already torn. I read the last message on a cloudy afternoon. I still think of you, of us. Can you forgive me? I closed the phone, placed it on the table, and poured myself a cup of tea. And I didn't reply. Forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken aloud. Forgiveness isn't so you can come back. Forgiveness is when your heart no longer waits for someone to change. When you stop asking, why did you do this to me? And instead offer a nod to yourself and walk forward. Clarice once sent a handwritten apology. The ink trembled. She claimed she never meant to destroy anything, as if destruction always required intent. I didn't answer, but I kept the letter. Not out of grace, but as a reminder, those who betray rarely remember when they lit the match. Until they're the ones burning. Each morning, I walk the villa halls with a cup of coffee in hand. I open the drapes, letting sunlight into rooms sealed off by a lifetime of pretending. I no longer have to be silent. Strangely now, silence feels like the purest kind of freedom. I didn't reclaim my life by making noise. I simply returned to the place that was always mine. No forgiveness, no vengeance, just becoming myself again.